the debates around refugees every election, and the fact that refugees were demonized made me really, really angry. So I'm a refugee lawyer by background, but actually I'm now working at Jindal Global Law School. I used to work with the UN Refugee Agency in Egypt and Turkey, and the Ministry of Justice in New Zealand. So pretty much all refugee work until now. And my family are migrants to Australia, but there's often this distinction which is drawn between good migrants and bad migrants, even within migrant and migrant communities in Australia, right? Or you came here through the legal way, you didn't come here through the legal way. That sort of discourse and narrative which just really made me very angry.
1951 Refugee Convention defines a refugee as, and I quote, someone who is unable or unwilling to return to their country of origin owing to a well-founded fear of being persecuted for the reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership, or of a particular social group or political opinion. Considering that this definition was drafted around 70 years ago, do you think that we need to broaden the scope of the definition?
So ideally, of course, right? Of course, you would have a more inclusive definition. The definition really was created in a different time, predominantly with the inputs from states from the West, right, and the global North. So has it really taken into account sort of displacement in the global South? Not necessarily. But practically, would states agree to a broadened definition? Possibly not, right? Given sort of the xenophobia and stigma which is associated with refugees today, I think that if anything, if that definition was put on the table again, states would try and narrow it down. Yeah, absolutely. I think they would, right? And I think the way to go about it is, I think, through case law. Right, so the definition has sort of the way it's been interpreted has broadened out with case law. But there's some populations which it's incredibly difficult to fit within that definition. For example, folks who are fleeing due to climate change or who are displaced due to climate change, right? So I think in addition to the refugee definition, we need to have sort of, broader, not broader, but alternate sort of avenues for those who might not fit within those definitions, alternative programs, for example, those fleeing due to climate change. But when we talk about the definition, it has evolved, right? I think today, you do have many claims based on gender, right? And gender is not a convention ground, but it's something which has sort of been expanded and evolved with courts. So I hope that it will continue to evolve and will be sort of more inclusive and take into account the realities which refugees do face. Different groups have different challenges, but I think it's important to keep the challenges of refugees on the agenda, because in this time when we're all facing difficulties, it's, I think, easy to kind of forget that migrants, for example, or refugees would be having issues, right? So I think that's the first step. I think the second step is if someone really wants to take that initiative, there are many refugee community organizations based in India, right, who you can reach out to, find out what they're doing, and find out, how maybe you'd be able to help. The refugee-owned businesses, support that sort of business, right? So I think when, the pandemic sort of started, people had fears that it would reach the settlements, and it has, right? What's challenging, I think, about camps is the fact that you've got such a high population density, right? So to give you an idea, in Cox's Bazar, in the camps there, the density is higher than cities like New York. So I think a key sort of way forward is to make sure that those funding needs are met. Which again is really challenging because governments themselves are struggling to deal with the situation with their own population. But again, we need to keep the issues of refugees on that agenda so they don't slip off the radar and people forget that, okay, people in camps are really facing a particular challenge given how constrained and dense they are.
The LGBTQ community has been subjected to violence and discrimination for a long time. What additional difficulties do they face as refugees in countries which do not even recognize their rights?
So most refugees, as you might be aware, flee to neighboring countries, and most refugees are in the global South. And there is a disparity in terms of laws which protect LGBTQ people in the North and the South. Whether we like to admit that or not, that is sort of how it how, if you look at any map and criminalization, that's sort of, there is that sort of divide. LGBTQ refugees do face specific challenges. I think, for example, if you're in a camp-based setting, you can be ostracized and really excluded. In urban settings, again, that stigma is there. In terms of employment opportunities, many LGBTQ refugees I've worked with have to engage in sex work to survive, to give you an idea. So there's definitely that sort of stigma. And in these countries, I mean, if you are fleeing to a neighboring country which has got hostile laws against LGBTQ people, if you're a citizen of that country, of course, there are risks to you, but they're only, aggravated if you are a refugee. And from my experience as a refugee lawyer, I think what's concerning is people who might be very progressive and have humanitarian values, sort of more broadly when it comes to refugees, don't necessarily apply that to LGBTQ refugees, right? And I've seen that firsthand in interviews, and sort of the questions that LGBTQ refugees are asked. For example, there's an overt focus on sexual history and sex lives, right? As proof, right? How does a court or an assessor prove that you are an LGBTQ person? Very invasive lines of questioning, which I think is something that needs to be moved away from, right? Which is again a really gradual process.